Windows Troubleshooting Part 1. In this nugget, we take a look at Windows troubleshooting. This is part 1, where we start off by taking a look at an overall sense of the boot and system recovery process. First thing we need to understand, though, is something about the boot order and how a boot process actually takes place and the boot files that are involved in it. So we'll address that, and then we'll also take a look at the recovery console, which addresses a lot of the problems that you can experience in this whole process that we see up here. Now, the recovery console is primarily a Windows XP tool, but you can use similar things in Windows Vista, for example, to also recover a failed system that will not boot properly. There's also various boot modes, particularly various iterations of safe mode that we'll investigate. And then we'll take a look at overall system recovery. This goes beyond just the boot process, although it could also repair that. And it goes on into addressing the system files that might have become corrupt or overwritten. You can use the ERD in Windows 2000 or ASR, which is Automated System Recovery, in Windows XP. And then, of course, Windows Vista also has a repair installation, which can also help to restore files to a known good configuration. Have you ever found yourself to be in a very awkward or difficult situation? It might be that you're working on a customer's computer and you're kind of at your wit's end. You really don't know where else to go, and they're sitting there staring at you, waiting for you to fix their computer. It might be a social occurrence where you feel quite awkward or something embarrassing has happened. I happen to be a geek, so that happens to me quite a lot. In fact, not long ago, my wife was speaking at a big event, and my wife is a very good public speaker, but she's not technical at all, and she speaks about other topics, things that I don't have much comprehension of at all, stuff like relationships and feelings and such. Anyway, so she was speaking at this conference, and it was right at the end, and it was a very emotional moment for all these people that were in the room, and I was sitting in the back trying to, to support my wife. Well, at a certain point, you could hear a pin drop, and it was just a very emotional moment, and right at that moment, I suddenly felt a sneeze coming on. Now, let me tell you something about my sneezes. They are earth-shattering. Very loud. I'm a little embarrassed about them. I just don't know how to make them any quieter, but they've always been that way. And this would have been the worst possible moment for me to sneeze. I looked over at the door and I realized I would not be able to make it to the door in time for this sneeze to come on. So in a last-minute moment of panic, I decided to just sneeze right into my right bicep, hoping that would kind of muffle the sound. Well, as it turned out, I was wearing a short-sleeve Under Armour shirt, and so when I tried to sneeze into my bicep, which is kind of massive, okay, not really. Anyway, when I tried to sneeze into my bicep, it made a horrible farting sound. And to make matters worse, you could hear the sneeze and you could hear the farting sound, so it made it sound as if I sneezed and was not able to hold myself together. Oh my goodness, what an embarrassment. Well, hopefully you don't have that kind of a situation happen to you, but you might still run into some situations that are awkward in terms of computer troubleshooting. One of the key things that you're going to have to know about when you're trying to troubleshoot a computer, first of all, is to understand some things about how it's supposed to operate in the first place. Now, we're going to take a look here. A lot of the things that we're going to be discussing are going to relate to booting up the computer or having basic operating system problems to where maybe you can't even load the operating system. So in order to get a good understanding for how to troubleshoot some of those things, we're going to first start off with taking a look at how it's supposed to start up in the normal BIOS sequence of events here. Okay? So the first thing, of course, would be you power on the computer. And then what would happen? Well, the BIOS loads, okay, and we've talked about BIOS in the past, so that's very simple. It just loads out of, and it reads any configuration it needs out of CMOS. And then it has to scan through the hardware, and it just checks to make sure that all your elemental or important components for the hardware are on and working, like you have the processor installed and properly seated. You have your memory installed and properly seated, and so forth. And we've talked about all those in the past as well. Then what happens is, after the post, the BIOS is configured, and this is true of all BIOS, configured to locate a boot sector somewhere. Okay? This is kind of a de facto standard where all BIOS will know where to look for a boot sector, and it should be on, of course, on the hard drive, or it could be on removable media. Then once it locates the boot sector, it'll start the master boot record, and from this point forward, you kind of come to a fork in the road, depending on whether you're running Windows XP or Windows Vista. And let's go ahead and take a look at both of those. So then let's go ahead and take a look at what happens with Windows XP in the boot sequence. Okay, so first you have your BIOS and post, which I just described. Then once that occurs and it's located the master boot record, it will first load ntloader, and that's exactly what it's the file. ntldr is the name of the file. And once it loads that, then the ntloader is programmed to look for another file known as boot.ini. We've discussed that a little bit in the past here as well. And this is the file that will simply identify where in the file system the operating system files are located. And if you have something like a dual boot scenario, or if you're using the recovery console as a dual boot scenario as well, then it will identify the location of those files as well. And then what will happen is something called the ntdetect kicks in. This is going to give us the base hardware in order to be able to get a basic operating system booted up. So it's going to be able to detect things such as the hardware, basic I/O devices, and things of this nature. Nothing super fancy yet. Your multifunction printer is not going to get detected particularly by ntdetect. You're not going to have high-end video card drivers loaded at this stage. This is just basic detection of devices in order for the operating system to continue on. And then you'll have ntos kernel.dll. I don't know if you can see the dot there, but there's a .dll here. And this is really the core of the operating system. Now, in order to run any version of Windows, it depends upon many, many files. In fact, thousands of files. However, if you could narrow it down to one file and say this is the core or the most essential piece of an operating system, it would be this one right here, ntos kernel. Then what happens is it will hand off to the hardware abstraction layer. Now, ntos kernel will continue to run. Okay, most of these other things are in the past now. They don't really have much bearing, except for, of course, the BIOS is still, going to be aware of everything that's going on. But the HAL will now be loaded, and this stands for Hardware Abstraction Layer. This is something that is pretty hard-coded in a lot of ways. For example, it's particularly hard-coded to the processor. So if you're running a 32-bit version of Windows, but you maybe re-imaged a machine that has a 64-bit processor, then when the HAL starts to detect the processor, it's going to have a problem and you're not going to be able to get a proper boot because the HAL was designed for 32, but you're trying to run it on a 64. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that you might see. If you were doing something like re-imaging and put the HAL on something of a different architecture. Similarly, if you made an image on Intel architecture, but you tried to restore it to an AMD architecture, then again, you would not be able to properly load the HAL and could not boot the operating system. Next thing that it'll do is it'll load the registry system key. Now, the registry system key is located under HQ local machine, and then under the first level after that, it's the system key. And this gives us key operating system configuration parameters. And then once those are loaded, it goes on to load specific device drivers. And these go beyond just the base detection that we saw earlier, but it will also replace any drivers that may have been loaded earlier as well. And it's these drivers that will truly interoperate between the physical hardware and the operating system itself. And again, we've talked about drivers many times in the past as well. And then finally, you'll have this ntos kernel that will continue to run as well. And I say that again because some of these load or they do their job and then they're not used anymore in the ongoing operating system, like these three things right here, for example. However, ntos kernel loads here, and then it continues to load, continues to run, and that, again, is pretty much the core of the operating system. And then with Windows Vista, it starts off the exact same way because any operating system is going to first have to wait for the BIOS and post to finish, okay? And then we have the boot manager. Now, this replaces ntloader, and like ntloader, it has to identify which operating system to load. ntloader would have referenced boot.ini. Boot manager references BCD, which is the boot configuration data. Now, this does replace the boot.ini, which, as you know, is a single file. BCD, though, is almost more of an entity. It's got a lot of different moving parts that are involved in it. One of the things that it involves is a registry hive, and it loads the registry hive that it needs from the boot directory. Now, I'm showing hidden system files here, so I'll show you that on the C drive, under boot, and you don't need to know this for the A+, I'm just telling you where it is, there's the BCD. That's what's actually going to be loaded into the appropriate registry hive, and then you can see here that it has a number of different languages and regions that it's capable of working with. And then much like previous versions of Windows, it'll load NTOS kernel. Again, that's really pretty much the core of the operating system, and that'll continue to run. NTOS kernel will also have to work with HAL, again, much like it did in previous operating systems, as I just described earlier. Then it will load the system registry key. Okay, so here we got a lot of things that are similar down in this section here. And then the device driver. So all of this part of it is pretty much going to be the same. It's just that it's now running Windows Vista instead of Windows XP. And there are also some boot messages that you might see specifically. And let's go ahead and address what those are. Especially these bottom three, because these are listed on the A+ exam objectives. So I'd be aware of those for sure. But the boot messages, these are all boot messages that you might see on the screen. I would put a kind of a star up here though as well. And that would be to check the BIOS boot order. Sometimes you'll get one of these messages only because the BIOS has been misconfigured to boot to the wrong device, or it's trying to boot from a floppy disk, for example, something like this. Now, if you get a message saying something about an inaccessible boot drive, what could that mean? What could be causing that? Well, very often, just as an FYI, that might be a hard disk drive, kind of messy there, hard disk drive failure. Okay, that may be all that is. You might just need to replace the hard disk drive. You might also see something that says invalid boot disk. What would this mean? Very often that relates directly to this item, the boot order. Okay, so if it says invalid boot disk, that's probably because you're trying to boot from the wrong device. So check that one out. You might also see this one, NT loader missing. In fact, in particular, it's going to be switched a little bit differently. But with Windows 2000 in particular, if you see that message, again, very often it points to this thing I mentioned earlier. It might be the BIOS boot order. And by the way of example, I kind of simulated that. Here I've gone to Windows 2000, where I changed the BIOS boot order to boot from a floppy disk first, and then it tells me that NT loader is missing. So we can see there that that's exactly what caused that situation to occur. So it may also mean that the floppy disk is in the drive, or the boot order is creating a problem. There's also one other one here that's not listed in the A+ exam objectives, but I would still be aware of this. It might say something to the effect of error loading operating system. Very often this will point to a corrupt MBR, okay? MBR problem, okay? So check that one out as well, and I would just be aware of these various messages. Now, fortunately, for some of the other problems that you might experience, for example, corrupt boot files like NTLoader and stuff like that, or problems with boot INI, we have a really good tool here called the Recovery Console. Now, the Recovery Console is a pretty comprehensive tool. It does a lot of different things to repair Windows, including some of the boot problems that we talked about earlier. In fact, I'll have to say right from the outset that if you're missing some of those boot files that I mentioned, or if something is corrupt in that whole process, it's very likely that the Recovery Console will be able to repair that. If it's not able to, it's very likely that you'll just have to do a reinstallation or a repair installation, because the Recovery Console really should take care of most any boot problem. But also I want to point out that this is for Windows 2000 and Windows XP. Windows Vista doesn't use this. Now, if you want to load the Recovery Console, how do you do that? Well, it has to be installed as a boot option, which will then appear as a boot INI boot option. Okay. In order to install it, what you'll be doing is you'll just put in the Windows DVD or CD or DVD. I guess it's a CD with XP, isn't it? And then just go to a command prompt, and let me just show you what you would have to type in here. You'll go to a command prompt, and you'll type this in right here. And I'm assuming that drive D is where the CD is inserted. You'd type i386. That would just take us to that i386 directory. And then we're pointing to the winnt32.exe command, again for 2000 or XP. And then /cmd-cons. And then you'll proceed through the prompts, and that will then add the Recovery Console for you, and it'll add a directory on the hard drive with many of the Recovery Console commands that can be used within the Recovery Console. Okay. Also, the Recovery Console, really what it is it's just another boot option that kind of comes to a command prompt. And this command prompt will then allow you to run many of the various tools that can be used to repair Windows. And it's very useful to use to fix Windows when you cannot boot the operating system itself because of a catastrophic kind of a problem. And then, of course, your other option would be to just boot from the CD. Now, this also presents a security vulnerability, because if I can just take the Windows XP CD, walk up to somebody's workstation while they're out at a 1.5-hour lunch, then I could just boot from it, access the recovery console, and couldn't I just access all of their files and copy stuff to a floppy drive or USB flash drive or something like that? No, I can't. And that's the one thing that Microsoft has done here is they've plugged that security hole so that when you boot from the CD or access it, from the boot option, either way, you can access only the operating system files, like the Windows directory and Windows System 32 and all the subdirectories there. If somebody has a folder there on their computer called My Critical Files or My Secret Files or whatever, you cannot access those. So this is not for data purposes. And in fact, if you're trying to go to the recovery console because the operating system seems to be really messed up and you want to try to recover the data, you're using the wrong tool. This will not do it for you. Also, you cannot copy files to a floppy. And this, again, is another security issue. In fact, even the operating system files and other files which are files that are not necessarily security sensitive, you still can't copy even those to a floppy disk. But the operating system files that might be corrupt or need to be replaced, those can be accessed through the recovery console. And you can see here that I have indeed installed the Windows Recovery Console so that it's available as one of the boot INI file options. So in order to load this, you simply select it by pressing Enter. It'll go through a few detection phases and everything, but what's going on here really is it's just loading the command console from the hard drive, because when you install it as a boot option, it also copies all of its files to the hard drive, so that way I don't depend on having the CD to boot from in order to access these same tools. And then after it's done with its own little boot process here, it identifies any installations of Windows that you have. You can see I only have the one, but if I had a dual boot scenario, for example, it would show a 1 and a 2 up there. In this case, I'll just press 1 and then press Enter to identify that first installation of Windows. Oh, and, and then here it asks for the administrator password. Gee, I hope I can remember this. It's been a long time since apparently that's not it. Let's try that one. There we go. Okay. You have to get this within 3 tries or else it forces you to reboot. So I was hoping that I wouldn't mess that up. And then if you want to identify what commands are that you can run from this, because the whole point of being here is to run various commands that can help you to repair Windows, for example, you just type help. And by pressing Enter, then it will show you all the different ones. And if I press the space key, then it will go through all the different ones here, go through them a page at a time. And then if I want to know more about a specific one of these items, for example, fix boot. Okay, so I want to know about, I just type that help fix boot. And that would show me some of the various ways to use, in this case there's not much to it, to use that particular command, but if there's other switches or options that are available, it'll show those to you as well. And then returning here to our whiteboard, we'll be discussing a little bit more about the recovery console and a few of the various options that it provides. But one of the first things I want to point out in resolving boot problems is probably the most obvious, and that is to check the physical. This means to make sure that everything is plugged in properly and the connections have not come loose and so forth, such as the serial ATA cable or the FireWire cable if there's an external drive, or the power cable, whatever, all those sorts of things, nothing has come loose. And even experienced A+ technicians will tell you that on occasion they may forget to check this and then go on some elaborate troubleshooting routine that takes an awful lot of time, only to find out that if they had just checked to see if something was properly plugged in the first place, they could have avoided wasting a lot of time. So check the physical. Also, the recovery console itself, which we just looked at, there's a lot more details, a lot more commands you can use in it, which kind of are beyond our scope here, really. But if you look up Knowledge Base Article 314058 on Microsoft's website, then you should be able to find more about that. Also, there's a tool here within the recovery console, one of the commands, called boot CFG. And one of the key things you might want to look at there is the rebuild option. This might be useful if you have trouble tracking down multiple operating systems or something that are installed there, as in a dual boot scenario or a multi-boot scenario. And using boot CFG, it will identify all the installations and then rebuild them so that the boot INI file will be repaired appropriately. There's also the fix MBR, which will do just that. It'll repair the master boot record. And this is a very useful command if you've had something like a boot sector virus destroy or alter the master boot record. Also make sure, by the way, that you have thoroughly done an antivirus scan before you run fix MBR. Otherwise, the problem could duplicate itself, or there's also situations in which it can actually create inaccessible partitions if there's still viruses there and you run fixMBR. So you have to be completely clean before you can run that tool. And then there's the fix boot item. What this is going to do is it's going to repair or restore the Windows boot sector code on the system partition. Now, if you're running Windows Vista, then you're not going to be using a boot INI file, so instead you'll need to adjust the boot properties of the operating system by using this tool, which is BCD Edit. And this has to be run as an administrator. If you want to know more about this, then you can go to Microsoft's website and look at 709667. Just do a search for that. It takes you to a TechNet article and all the various command prompt options that you can use to adjust the settings for BCD Edit. Now, most of the methods that I've shown you thus far have been really specific to Windows XP or 2000. For Windows Vista, what you'll do to equivocate a lot of those same kinds of troubleshooting techniques will be to use different tools by booting from the Windows Vista DVD. So here I've done just that, booted from the DVD. And then what I would do is I would choose to repair your computer, this second option that we see down here. Then I would identify the installations of Windows that were available. This might take a little bit of time. And then we'll just go ahead and click on Next. Now, what it's going to do next is a number of different options. I could do Startup Repair. This is where it's going to do exactly what it says and fix problems that are preventing Windows from starting. So, if there's anything in the boot configuration data that's corrupt or missing, it'll attempt to repair that. And this, again, is one of those tools that I was mentioning earlier that's extremely comprehensive in repairing the startup process. And if it can't fix it, you're probably just going to have to do a repair installation or a reinstallation of Windows, because it's pretty comprehensive. We'll talk more about System Restore and Windows Complete PC Restore a little bit later on. But just FYI, there's also this Windows Memory Diagnostic tool. If you suspect that one of your memory modules is physically defective somehow or has some kind of a hardware error, and you can also open up a command prompt to do a variety of other commands as you prefer. Now, provided Windows is properly booting, and that's not something you need to troubleshoot, but maybe you're having other issues, such as every time you boot the computer, it blue screens or it locks. This is very often the case, especially after you install new drivers or software. If that's the case, it might be useful to go into one of the various safe modes that are available. In order to get to that, you'll need to press F8 before you see the splash screen for Windows Vista or for Windows XP, actually for any version of Windows. And that'll give you a menu then of safe modes that you can select from. Now, for example, here I've pressed F8 right after the post for the BIOS. Now, this is kind of a very narrow window of time that you have to do this. Sometimes I've had to reboot the machine multiple times because I just couldn't seem to hit F8 right on the precise moment that it needed to be there. Nevertheless, here it is. And you can see a number of these options. Now, we're not going to specifically address every single option, but let me go ahead and address the ones that are relating to safe modes at least. Now, this is the main one that we'll possibly be using, and what this does is it loads only the essential operating system files necessary. It's not going to load a bunch of additional fancy services. It's not even going to load your antivirus software, for example. It's not going to load anything in the startup group that you've put there as a result of an installed program, for example. It's not going to load any of your fancy drivers for your multifunction printer or a high-end video card. It is going to load driver files so that you can get basic I/O and so that you can at least see the operating system. You're going to get just basic video as well. You're not going to get high resolution or a lot of the DirectX fancy kind of things that you might otherwise get in a normal boot installation of Windows. It doesn't update the last known good. That's supposed to be LKG there. It does not update the last known good configuration. And what is that? Well, in almost any version of Windows, what happens is when it has a successful shutdown, it makes record of the boot environment and the operating system environment. A lot of different factors that are involved in that. And then that way, if you run into a problem to where you've installed something or made a change and now it doesn't want to boot, you can boot to the last known good configuration. Now, safe mode does not update that last known good configuration on shutdown. And that would be important because you only get one copy of the last known good. And if I'm having troubles and I say, you know what, instead of going to the last known good, I'm going to go to safe mode. Well, if it did update last known good, then when I shut down safe mode, I would have overwritten my only good copy of the last known good state. So because of that, safe mode no longer overwrites LKG. It used to do that in old versions of Windows. Another reason why you might want to use safe mode is because if you boot into a normal operating system, then maybe there's a virus problem in your operating system. Well, within safe mode, number one, it somewhat gives you a better chance of not having that virus running and operational when you're in safe mode. You can't rule that out completely. Some viruses are very clever and can run even in safe mode, but many cannot. So anyway, if the virus is not running, that makes it a little bit easier to remove that virus and check with your vendor's software. Some of them may be able to run within safe mode, at least from the installation CD, for example. Also, if you've had driver problems, I just installed maybe a new video driver, and now when I restart the computer, I only get a black screen. I have no way of interoperating with Windows because I can't see what I'm doing. Well, if that's the case, I would probably, again, reboot into safe mode and uninstall that driver. When you do boot into safe mode, it also creates an nbtlog.txt file. What this identifies for you is every driver that it attempted to load during the boot up process. And you can also choose to create that same log using one of the other boot options, which I'll show you here shortly. And that might be useful if you want to identify which driver it is or which service or which other process it is that's failing when the system is trying to boot up. And that very often is what's going to happen if you try to start Windows and it just hangs and it never seems to give you a logon screen. You can also use safe mode plus networking. This might be useful if you want all the advantages of safe mode because you want to eliminate any of the other additional installed programs or drivers as causes of the problems first. But you do need to get to the network. Maybe you need to, in safe mode, connect to a network share that has utility drivers of some kind or utility programs or troubleshooting programs. You might be able to use it for that. And then you can also do safe mode in the command prompt only. And with this, it does not even load a desktop for you. It only loads a command prompt. And that would help to, again, reduce or almost eliminate any potential video problems from the equation. And then as a way of example, I've gone to Windows Vista here and pressed F8 after the post to get us the advanced boot options, which I've just been discussing. So here you can see, for example, that I have safe mode available, and that's what I have described, as well as safe mode with networking and command prompt. Now, as we move down the list, we also have boot logging, and this will create an ntbtlog.txt file that will show all the drivers that load during startup. That might be useful because it will show you next to each one whether it was successful or whether it failed, and that way you can identify which one of the drivers is causing, for example, a startup type of a problem. You can also enable low-resolution video if you want Windows to start normally and give you all of your applications and startup items and the like. It's just that you're suspicious of your video driver and you think that it might be causing a problem. So if that's the case, then you are able to successfully boot to low-resolution video, then you can confirm that something is wrong with your video driver or configuration. There's also the last known configuration, which I talked about earlier as well. And there's directory services restore mode, which doesn't apply to us. It's only used on domain controllers to manage or maintain Active Directory in an offline state. And then there's also demugging. If you go to this mode, you will never be mugged. Not ever. Debugging mode, and this will enable the Windows kernel debugger. This is mostly useful for developers that need to get extremely specific details about the operating system as it starts up. And then disable automatic restart on system failure. Now this actually is probably important for A+ exam objective purposes. If you have a user that complains that when they turn their computer on, it gets caught in an endless loop of rebooting over and over and over again, you might need to disable that automatic restart so that you're able to then troubleshoot the computer. Otherwise, it never boots into anything so that you can try to work on it. Okay. You can also disable driver signature enforcement. Current versions of Windows do not normally allow unsigned drivers to be installed, but you can override that with this option here. And then, of course, you can start Windows normally as well. And then finally, before we close this particular nugget out, let's address some of the other items that we can take a look at here relating to system recovery. This is going to be a little bit more of a broad scope. One thing you could use with this in Windows 2000 or XP, again, is going to be Recovery Console to use any of the various tools that we looked at. If you're using Windows 2000, you could use the Emergency Repair Disk. There's other more elaborate tools now, especially in Windows Vista, that are probably better than this, but given if you have only Windows 2000, you can use this tool to create the disk. And what it'll do is it'll create a record of your current operating system environment, the registry as well. If you choose to back that up, it'll back that up for you. It'll identify things such as the startup environment. For example, your boot INI, then all of the boot characteristics, the boot sector itself. It'll identify that location. The system files, it just confirms that. If you were to use the ERD disk in a recovery process, it would confirm that you actually have the system files that you need to boot the operating system and to run it. And then again, like I said, it'll back up the registry if you choose to. If you do need to restore any of the files, because maybe they're missing or corrupt, this will require that you provide the CD. Now, do be aware of the fact that the files that you repair or that you replace from the CD may be older versions of the files that are on the operating system. So, for example, if the CD is just the out-of-the-box edition of Windows 2000 Professional, but you're on Service Pack, let's say Service Pack 3 or something like that, well, then a lot of those operating system files have probably been updated. So if you restore the files from the CD, which the ERD will do for you automatically, then you may kind of retrograde some of your files, and you may need to reapply service packs and other types of updates. Also, you can do for system recovery, you can do a repair installation, and I talked about that in an earlier nugget, and that's where you will do an in-place upgrade. That means that when we boot from our CD or our DVD, we don't choose to do a repair immediately. We'll choose initially to do an installation, and then one of the options you'll see there is to do a repair install, and we've seen that in the past, so I won't elaborate on that for the time being. But let's go ahead and take a look at the ERD and how you actually create the disk. The way you get your emergency repair disk is to go to the backup utility, which I've already gotten there, but you can see here that's under Programs, Accessories, and then System Tools, and then Backup. Okay, once I got there, I launched this up. And then we have the emergency repair disk. This is where we can select to also back up the registry, and we click OK here. Then what it does is it copies all of the information about the operating system, well, not all of it, but all of the pertinent information relating to troubleshooting that would allow you to repair this installation of Windows. This is also, by the way, specific to this one installation of Windows. I cannot take this diskette and use it on another Windows 2000 machine because there's certain things such as disk signatures and the like that are unique to this one installation of Windows. And then to actually use that ERD disk, here you can see that I've booted to Windows 2000 Professional, and I'm going to repair Windows 2000 by pressing R, so I just press that item. And then what it'll do here is it'll ask me to either go to the Recovery Console or using the emergency repair process, which infers that I'm going to be using that disk. So I'll go ahead and press R to use that disk. And then you can do a manual repair or a fast repair. Manual just allows you to choose from a list of options. A fast repair very often is just a quick and dirty way to get where you need to go. I'm just going to be choosing the F one just to be fast right now. And then if you have the emergency repair disk, go ahead and press Enter. You don't have to have the emergency repair disk. It'll still attempt to locate where Windows 2000 is. And of course, you have the Windows 2000 CD as well. So it'll still do a checksum on the files that are on the hard drive and compare that checksum against the files that are on the CD, and may still attempt to replace certain files that don't seem to match up there. But I'll just go ahead and press Enter here, and then it asks me to insert the Windows 2000 Emergency Repair Disk into Drive A. I think it's still there, so I'll go ahead and press Enter. And then it just goes ahead and does its little thing. And this could take quite a while, but at the time that it's done, it'll go ahead and should have for you at least a bootable operating system. Although, once again, ooh, that was faster than I thought. Sometimes virtual machines go through this whole thing a lot faster. But anyway, it should have at least an operating system that is bootable, even though I might have lost some configuration settings. Now with Windows XP, it's similar to the emergency repair disk that we saw in Windows 2000, but it goes a step further in that it also backs up the system. Okay, so it's just also a complete backup here. So I'll just click on this item, and it's going to go to the Automated System Recovery Preparation Wizard, and then I'll just choose where I want the backup to be stored. I actually have a drive, I think, with enough space on it. And where'd it go? I guess it's not there. Oh, there it is. I don't know why that wasn't showing up. Anyway, there's my backup drive, drive E. I'll just call this backup for lack of anything more creative. Then as I click on next and finish, you'll see that after it's done backing up, it's going to also ask for a floppy disk where it can write the recovery data necessary to restore the operating system. You can see here once it's done with the main backup, then it asks for the floppy disk. I'll go ahead and put that in and click OK. And then it says that the automated system recovery disk for this backup has been created. I just need to keep it in a safe place in case I need to use it for an ASR recovery. And then the next thing I'm going to show you here is I'm going to reboot this computer, and then I'll start an ASR recovery so that you can see what that looks like. And then here you can see I've rebooted the operating system. I'm going to go ahead and press the escape key this time to go ahead and boot to the CD-ROM drive. And then we can see to press any key to boot from the CD. That's exactly what I'm doing. It's going through its little startup process, but what I want to point out here is down at the bottom, see it should show me in a moment. I think press F2. There it is, F2, and I'm pressing the key. If I want to load an ASR. Now, it's a very fast screen that appears down at the bottom, and it's another one of those things that's very easy to just miss, so you have to be looking right at it when that message appears. And then here what you can see it's doing is it's rejiggering, so to speak, the hard drives. It's taking data from the ASR drive and it's reapplying signatures and data to those drives. So once it's reapplied the signature and the configuration for the various partitions, and in this case there's only one, then it will just restore all of the files from the backup that was made earlier. Alright, so Windows 2000, we have ERD. Windows XP, we have ASR. Here in Windows Vista, we have something different called System Restore. Now, ERD and ASR can potentially be pretty comprehensive restores that might take a great deal of time and restore quite a few different files, and it can also revert you back to a position where you may have to reapply service packs and things of this nature. System Restore is available for Windows Vista. I guess I should have put that on there. And by the way, it's also good for Windows 7. Okay, same thing. I gotta tell you, this right here is an excellent tool. Yes, my kids have me texting nowadays, so I can't seem to spell properly anymore. Some of you are rolling your eyes right now. Well, if you really object that much, you can text me your objections, okay? Anyway, so it is a fantastic tool, though. It saved me a lot of time in the past. And what this is, it's kind of a time machine backup, although I guarantee it's better than that movie Hot Tub Time Machine. I've never actually seen the movie, but judging from the previews, that's one movie I would never want to see. To me, it was just totally stupid. Anyway, that's a tangent we don't need to go down. But it is kind of a time machine backup, because what you do with this is you can manually create backups, as I'll show you in a little while, or you can wait for a scheduled backup to take place. And the System Restore backup that is created can be useful to restore you to a previous point in time. That's another way to look at these, as point-in-time backups. Now, this is only going to back up key operating system files, the registry information, and it does not back up any user data. So this is mainly to restore your applications and operating system back to a known good state. It's also much better than the last known good that we could also have used, because this is much more flexible and it goes back several, quite a bit in terms of the history of this tool. Whereas something like last known good, that's only the last time you successfully started up and shut down. What if you installed something today but you didn't actually use it for 3 or 4 days? Well, then your last known good would be outdated, because you would only have one that was the same thing. It would have the same bad information in it. So what we do with this is really nothing automatically. It's created for you automatically on a daily basis, and then you can also manually create it if you want as well. I got to show you this. I wanted to put a reminder to myself out here to the side. There's a website called the Windows Club. For some reason, it's kind of escaped me in the past. I never really have looked at it, but I've been investigating it recently. Really good stuff there. And in fact, this is their website right here. This is one of their utilities that they have, and you can see the URL right there, thewindowsclub.com. And this thing right here is going to be a one-click quick restore maker. So if I wanted to manually create a backup using the restore points, well, normally you'd have to dig your way through a control panel, or if you happen to know the thing to type in, you could actually type it in. Which, by the way, if you do that from a run line, would be RSTRUI. Okay, that would bring up the system restore. But anyway, this Windows Club utility that I just showed you, all you have to do is you create a shortcut for this, maybe on your desktop like I've done, and I just double-click on it, and almost immediately, with administrative permission, it just starts. And there it is. It's creating a restore point for me right now. So it's not really an A+ exam item, but I think you'll find that very useful. They have a lot of other really good tools there you might want to look at, although I can't vouch for all of them. Now, this is very useful as well because it's going to automatically create a restore point prior to driver updates or installations, application installs, and updates. Okay, so for all of those things, any one of those things could potentially cause a system to stop working properly, and you might want to go back to the previous point in time made right before you installed one of those items. It does use a little bit of disk space. It requires at least 300 megabytes, and it will use up to a maximum of 15% of the hard drive space. So the way this works is you would just be on your Vista machine here, for example. Again, very similar for Windows 7, if you want to know about that for the future purposes. You'd go into System and Maintenance, and then we would go to Backup and Restore Center, and then over here on the left, you'll see that there's this Create a Restore Point or Change Settings. So you can click on that item and click Continue. And then here, we would simply say we want to create a restore point, and we would, name this something, before installing maybe beta software that could potentially mess up your system or something like that. Or maybe you're installing an unsigned driver that could potentially create a problem as well. So you would create that restore point and then move on. But again, remember, with drivers, updates, and most applications, it will automatically create the restore point for you anyway, but just as an added level of protection, you can do this if you want to. And then you would just simply click on Create, and it would, after you have typed all that in, it would just go ahead and create that restore point for you. Now, when it comes time to restore, you go through the same interface. You'd be in the same Windows control panel option. It's just that you would choose to restore instead of create a backup. And then the other option there, if you don't want to click through all that stuff, would be that you could type RSTRUI, and that would bring up the interface here for restoring system files and settings. Now, what it recommends is that I go back to this recommended update that I had back here. This is one that was automatically created apparently at 3 o'clock in the morning. There was an update apparently that took place then, and so I could restore right back to this point in time, which was right before the Windows update took place. Or you can choose a different restore point here as well, and you can see here that I created a manual one before installing Office 2010. I didn't actually install it. I just wanted to type something in there, and so I could use that one and then click on Next. Now, of course, if I'm not actually having problems with this update, I sure wouldn't want to select that one, because then it would roll back to a previous point in time for my updates. But here, if I was having problems after installing Office or whatever it is that I was doing, then I would just select that one. I click Next and Finish. Then it has to restart the computer. And I'll go ahead and go back and show you that here as soon as this computer restarts. And then it'll apply the restore point, reboot again, and then you should be back to a known good configuration when you log on to Windows the next time. Also, while I'm waiting for this, just be aware that you can also boot from the Windows Vista DVD, and as part of the repair process there, you can also choose to restore a previous point as well. And then you may receive a message saying that it's restoring everything here for you, so just give that a little bit of time. Then the system will shut down, and when it restarts, we'll again have our known good configuration. So then now here we are back in our known good configuration using a system restore. Now I do want to point something out here. If you've been having troubles with viruses, do go back into Control Panel here, and before you even remove the virus, even if you want, you can go back into Backup and Restore Center and go back to Create a Restore Point or Change Settings here, and I would recommend that you disable restore points. Okay, so just turn off System Restore temporarily. Why would that be? Because there could be a virus in one of those restore points. And so it's possible that one of the previous restore points that still contains the virus or information about the virus could get restored onto the system, and you might accidentally reinstall it. So I would just recommend that if you're having trouble with viruses, turn this off, clean up the viruses. When you're all done with that, come back in here and then re-enable the system restore. In this nugget, we took a look at Windows troubleshooting, and this was part 1, where we primarily focused on boot problems and overall system recovery. In order to understand the boot problems, though, we first took a look at the boot order so that we could see some of the boot files that were involved in that whole process. Well, if you do have boot problems, however, you can often use the recovery console to recover those things, such as fixMBR, fixboot, and some other utilities that you might be able to use there. And then we took a look at the various boot modes as well. This would be useful if you're not able to boot into Windows normally, but you might be able to use something like safe mode. And then if you have, again, system file problems and you're not able to get a healthy operating system in general, you can use system recovery a couple of different ways. The emergency repair disk method that we saw in Windows 2000, and the automated system recovery that we just looked at here for Windows XP. And then, again, Windows Vista has the install repair process. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.